welcome back. We have a half an hour now for some dialogue, and then we'll have a short break before we move into our concluding session. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's what they call a reactions button. And if you press that, you'll see a yellow hand. And because I can only see a number of you, and the same for Rob or Callum in the background, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, press one of those hands, and then that'll bring you, I think, into the front screen, and then we'll be able to see you more readily. And either Callum or Rob will also help to highlight the fact that you are there and want to make an intervention. For this session, I'm going to begin very quickly with a few comments in the chat box, and then I'm opening it up to the whole floor for either personal comments or questions, but also please take responsibility among yourselves for feeding back to us some of the material from those small groups, particularly if something arose that you think would be relevant or important for the larger group to hear about. So I'm not asking for reports from the groups, but do please take responsibility for feeding us back with some of the wisdom. Very quickly, a few questions from the chat box first. The ordination of women, is that an issue that we should be looking at, or is it an issue we tend to over-exaggerate? For the moment, I don't think it's relevant. Anything I've said today can be activated and facilitated by lay people. You don't need a priest at all for any of it. So I think we need to focus more on the empowerment of the people of God as people without worrying too much about priesthood for the moment, at least. Then from Carmen, just let me see, approaches that are the faith, the paths of the church, particularly in Latin America, will not be silenced again. Okay, that's basically acknowledging the richness of the material that was presented today. Margaret Ann, did the Celtic Church keep an equal sense of community? I don't know the answer to that. Certainly in the Celtic spiritual tradition, there was a very close affiliation with the earth. Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, it was the Irish monks that introduced a lot of this heavy penitential stuff into mainland Europe. So I think there are bits of contradictions there. I would need to look more closely at the evidence before being able to answer your question. Mike, so good to hear of the scripture of hopping big ship that blocks many channels to justice. I'm reading through this question. Right. Yeah, I'm glad that the whole notion of the Spirit is being affirmed, and that the Spirit doesn't just come at baptism nor just come at Pentecost in the case of the church, but has always been there in the background. Francis Hall, the Brueggemann quote number 3 seems central to me, which I find difficult. What is it about God and human nature? Yeah, what is it about God's and our human nature that needs grieving before healing can emerge? That's a very profound question, which we won't have time to deal with this afternoon. It's part of the whole paradoxical creation of which we are a part. I mean, there is a destructive element to creation at large. It's that great paradox of creation and destruction that they describe elegantly in the unfolding of the new cosmology. And so, yeah, woundedness and healing are almost complementary sides of the one coin. Now, that's a paradox. It's not a fundamental flaw, which I think is quite important. And I guess it's part of the price we pay for human freedom and for creativity. If we had a perfect world devoid of all this pain and all this fallout stuff, then we'd all be robots. So it may not be the best or the finest of all possible worlds, but it's certainly the most creative and the one most conducive to the gift of freedom, I think. Margaret Healy. Yeah, plenty of material to think about, okay. Now let me just see. I think the rest is mainly comments. Yeah, okay. Right, let's come to the main group then, and an opportunity for you to raise your voice. Daniel J. Cronin, come in, please. Unmute yourself. So again, the practice here, unmute yourself. make your contribution and then mute yourself again.
I'll be brief. I'll try to be brief. I think I was in group 8. It was a privilege to be in group 8. In the spirit of your talk this morning, I was the only man. Therefore, the rest were women. Of them, at least 3 were nuns, or was it 4? And it was stunning stuff to hear, and I loved every moment. And I value immensely all you said this morning. It made sense, and it illuminated a very great deal, which has been somehow, Holy Saturday has always been a bit of a funny time. I think, thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Yeah, thank you. And again, as I said this morning, for me as a man, this stuff is hugely important. I would hope and pray, and I'm sure it is very empowering for women too, but I think ultimately it's empowering for all of us who embrace the Christian mantle. Yes, Paul, please.
Yes, there was a question in our group that we were discussing about somehow, just to avoid misunderstanding, the resurrection. Did it really happen? Now, around that question, we were trying to see the first things about the words, remembering the words. So is the resurrection just remembering, reconstructing the prophecies of the Old Testament into a new vision, or is it more than that? What do we do with the resurrection now?
This is a topic which would require a lot of time to explore the different dimensions of it. So basically, the view in the Christian story for most of the 2000 years was the belief that the resurrection was the resuscitation of a dead body. I don't think anybody today takes that literalness in the way that we did in the past. Now, so the position is, there's kind of a basic honesty. We don't know what happened to Jesus. And at one sense, it's not that important. And maybe it's more respectful not to speculate too much about it. The gospel writers constructed a story, which again was perfectly in keeping with the journalism of their day, to describe a kind of a miraculous rising from the dead, congruent with that of other heroic figures in some of the other ancient religions around the same time. And therefore the glorification of the earthly king in a heavenly throne. And so once again, they're operating out of this paradigm of the Godhead as kingship, something Jesus totally rejected, we believe nowadays. Therefore, it seems to be a more honest position to say, let's stay and try to come to terms with the experience of the first witnesses. Instinctively and intuitively, they were experiencing God and Jesus among them in a more radical, real way than even in his earthly life. And that's what empowered them to go forth. And therefore, we see resurrection, therefore, as something not just about Jesus, but about the early witnesses, and potentially the invitation and the empowerment for all of us to rise up. And I'm using that language in terms of justice, particularly, and keep faithful to the task of the empowerment of the gospel. And I think that's the approach that several theologians and scripture scholars would use today in exploring the notion of resurrection. The final comment, just to repeat what I said earlier today, therefore, resurrection should be seen as complementing the life of Jesus and not merely linked in with the death. If you link it in with the death too narrowly, you're into literalism. And that's not likely to get us to the deeper truth. I hope that's a sufficient response for now. It's a big topic, but it's for another time, I think. Mary Jo, please unmute yourself and please come in.
Diarmuid, we're having our usual cosmic group. And what I'd love to hear from you, so I can take it to them, I loved your exposition of Holy Saturday, is how can we bring more liberating justice out of lockdown?
Oh, I think, again, another big question for almost a workshop on its own. I think we need to wake up to the very close affiliation and interrelationship between ourselves and the other organisms that inhabit the planet with us. And in order to do that, we have to return and reclaim our fundamental identity as earthlings, as creatures of the earth. For so long, we've been told that our earthly status is a distraction. It's where we become enmeshed in sin and temptation and materialism. And therefore, we just have to wait until we escape this vale of tears and escape to a life hereafter. We have got to leave all that pseudo-spirituality behind us. It doesn't belong to God. It doesn't belong to Jesus. It doesn't belong to the vision of the new reign of God or the kingdom of God. We are earthlings, and we can't live meaningfully on this earth unless we learn to relate in whole new ways with the bats, with the animals, with the birds, with the planet itself. That is the huge lesson coming out of COVID-19. And sadly, with all the emphasis now on the vaccine, and I support the idea of a vaccine, but we're in danger of seeing the short-term solution as the long-term solution. And it's not, and it's not going to be. And if we don't wake up and learn from what nature is saying back to us on this virus, I'm afraid it's just going to be a short number of years, and maybe even a few months, before we'll have even a more serious crisis on our hands. There is big learning here, and there's very urgent learning.
Yeah, thank you.
David, come in, please, unmute yourself.
Well, Diarmuid, first of all, just thanks for the presentations this morning. I'm just reflecting on the recent new translation in the lectionary in England that came out, and how resistant, I suppose, the authorities are to view new interpretations of Scripture. I'm wondering, as you listen to homilies on a Sunday, where the literal understanding of the Bible is presented, how do you see the way forward for a more enlightened view that you've given us today?
I think I linked back with Mary Jo's question a few minutes ago. I think maybe COVID-19 is going to begin waking up a lot of these beloved people preoccupied with fine details around translation, around text, and so forth. We're only at the beginnings of bits of research which are coming out piecemeal, really. For example, somebody in London has done, from the London School of Economics, they reckon that, and this is not just for the Catholic Church, it's for all the churches, that those regularly attending Sunday services and others will drop by 50% immediately. And indeed, within a year or two, it might be down as low as 70% as a result of COVID. I think more and more people just have become very casual. With respect, the people that are mainly using the streamline facilities tend to be older people and some younger people who like a more devotional approach to liturgy and prayer. They're not worried about language, that particular group. And so really, it's a sad reality of what's happening, that so much attention is going to something that's completely secondary, peripheral, and almost totally irrelevant in the face of the crisis that's now facing all the churches, not just the Catholic Church. Where it's going to pinch, and which is the bit they're looking at, and of course is the wrong place to begin, is the financial loss they're going to endure. What they should be looking at is asking themselves, why is this happening to us? And what's the call to a whole sense of renewal and reform? And maybe the crisis has to go a bit deeper before people will begin asking these more discerning, critical questions, and then begin to give more devoted and give more discerning attention to priorities. Somebody else, or some feedback from the groups?
Esther has posted in the chat.
Yes, Anne, go ahead, unmute yourself first, please.
I think Jean Newbold put her hand up.
I did. I don't know how to work this thing, Dermot.
You're
anyway.
unmuted just now, Jean.
Yeah, I have done.
Okay, go ahead, Jean, please.
One question.
Yes.
Why is it, and maybe I read it in one of your books or some other book years ago, but why is it that the creed, our Christian Catholic creed that we say, or meant to be said on a Sunday, misses out the life of Jesus? It talks about belief in God, belief in Jesus born of a virgin, and then it goes right on to suffered under Pontius Pilate, and was killed and was buried. And it doesn't say anything about what you've been talking about today, which is the kingdom of empowerment, the life of Jesus, and what that means, what he was saying, what our mission is, what we should be doing.
Yeah, okay. Two things about the creed. I don't think the church itself ever intended the creed initially to be a prayer. And the creed is basically a political statement coming out of the council of, I can't remember now, is it Chalcedon or Nicaea or one of those councils? And it was used by Constantine and his followers to try and bring about conformity within all the believers across the Roman Empire at the time. Secondly, the creed seems to have stayed mainly, you see, when you look at St. Paul at his writings, he talks about the gospel. But the gospel that Paul is talking about, which he explicitly states in one of the letters to the Corinthians, it's about the death and resurrection of Jesus only. Paul never says anything about the Sermon on the Mount. He never says anything about parables or miracles or the kingdom of God. You begin to wonder, did Paul know much at all about the real Jesus? Why did he have that huge preoccupation around the death issues? It may have something to do with his personal guilt for the way he was persecuting the people of the way before he turned over and became a member himself. It may be something more personal. He talks at times about the thorn in the flesh. Whatever the reasons, Paul had a huge preoccupation about trying to make sense and meaning out of suffering. And it became almost an exclusive preoccupation of his. And it's very strong going through all his writings. And therefore, in the early church, that part of the Gospels, and then when it came to the writing of the Gospels, that was the first part that apparently was written. And then the other parts were added later. That may also explain why the creed stays so much with that bit. But I think the important thing about the creed is that it probably was never intended to be a prayer. It has been made one, and I don't think it's particularly helpful. I think huge numbers of people on Sunday, they rabbit off the words with little or no understanding of what those words actually mean. Anne, come in, please.
Thank you, Dermot. In our group, we spoke about how difficult it is to let go of old patterns and old ways of thinking, and the mourning that goes along with that, and that's the experience for lots and lots of people in the church at the moment, and that the church as she is now is not going to offer spaces for that, is not going to offer places of listening and where people can speak about the hurt and the harm and the things that they've experienced. And so it's going to take a lot of courage and commitment and conviction from the people who do get it to be able to create those spaces. And right. that includes with our clergy also, to have the courage to speak to them about reading the signs of the times here. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I mean, at the end of the day, our clergy are human beings like everybody else, and I too want to include them. But I think we need to move ahead with or without clergy. And so I would certainly want to say to the lay people, get on with it. Create some basic networks and begin rebuilding things. Whatever people tend to say about America, that's one of the great inspiring things that I've seen from the United States. It also happens in Europe, but much more so across the United States, where somebody reads a book and becomes very excited about it, buys a half dozen copies, begins inviting people to her home or to his home, maybe over the season of Lent, and create a reading group. It might be only a once-off, but in several cases, I've seen where that morphed into a much longer group a kind of a basic ecclesial community almost. Sometimes it just stayed as a reading group, while also mutually supporting the members, but it often morphed into a peace and justice group, or what they might call a social action group. And in some cases, I've seen that same group then go into a third wave, where they began developing the self-confidence of creating their own liturgies and their own rituals, with various celebrations around our sacramental realities. That's what I call networking. And it just takes the courage or the vision or the imagination of one or two people to get it kick-started. And away we go. That's the pattern I would suggest for the future.
Thanks, Dermot. That's much along the lines of the cells that we are envisaging for the Scottish Laity Network. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Peter, please come in. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, Dermot, thank you very much for your talk, and you've opened up all sorts of questions in my mind that I'll have to go away and think about. But one of the things that struck me is that I think I've always considered that the very, very earliest roots of the development of a male hierarchical church lie in Jesus's choice of the 12. I wonder what your speculation is about whether that was like that, or whether he chose among them some women, or whether, or what, how do we deal with that particular piece of the gospel?
Okay, good question. A very good question. I think for a start, it's important to acknowledge that apostleship or discipleship in the Gospels is not simply the 12. That image has been kind of sort and portrayed, that the primary discipleship of Jesus was the 12. There's at least 3, if not 4 other groups mentioned, but not often referenced. Luke refers to the group of 72, and they seem to be quite involved. There was obviously a group of women around, and I suspect myself, from what I said this morning, that they would have also included some males. And then in John's Gospel, we have this group called the Community of the Beloved Disciple. They were also about discipleship or apostleship. So I think that's, the picture is much more complex than what we have inherited. The Jesus Seminar group in the States, you can look that up if people aren't familiar with them, the Jesus Seminar, who would be considered to be a very progressive, radical kind of group and not at all liked among Catholic scholars. They basically say quite bluntly that in all probability, the 12 apostles never existed. And that it's an attempt at articulating a continuity with the 12 tribes of Israel and their rehabilitation or reinsertion into the Christian story to show continuity with the Hebrew scriptures. That therefore the 12 represent primarily the 12 tribes of Israel and should be seen more as a symbolic statement rather than a literal statement. I'm inclined to go along with that view. And so, you know, did Jesus have favorite apostles or disciples? Probably, if the truth were to be told, the group that was closest to his heart was the group of Mary Magdalene. But certainly this idea of isolating the 12 and considering them to be the best and the most exclusive and the primary models for discipleship just doesn't stand up anymore. Is that okay, Peter? Yeah, good, thank you. Agatha, come in, please.
Yeah. What should we be doing towards the unification of the date of Easter for all Christians, including the Orthodox?
I think all I can say to that is reach out a hand of invitation and welcome. We do have a problem. The problem with some of the Eastern Orthodox churches, from the little I know about them, is that they also have a kind of a rigid side to them, and at times a bit maybe of an imperial side, that somehow they have it right and that their dates for celebrating Christmas and Easter are different from us in the West, and that we should all go and do things their way. And I'm not saying that that's the representative position of all of them. It certainly is of some of the ones that are often reported. So yeah, I think in terms of channels of dialogue, can we begin dialoguing and opening up the kind of dialogue that would look more at the commonalities we hold together rather than the issues that make us different or divide us? I know that's a very general answer to your question, but I think it's probably the best that I can offer. Anne Smith, unmute yourself and come in, please.
Lovely. Hello, Diarmuid. Thank you very much. One of the things we said in our group, we spoke about the challenge that it would be to have the version of the story that you've been telling us today, have it recognized within parish liturgies and whatever. You know, the Good Friday liturgies, the Eucharistic prayers in any Sunday, promote an idea of the theology of atonement, of Jesus dying for a vengeful Father. Although people in our group said, you know, if priests were actually to speak the message that you spoke of crucifixion, young people would buy that a lot more, and it makes a lot more sense to us. But there is a sort of a brick wall there that is difficult to penetrate. The same for Holy Saturday. You know, the two pathways that you speak of, and only one of them ever being promulgated. And I know there's a whole church history of 2,000 years of building on a distorted story that gets more difficult to dismantle. So we had that discussion in our group, and then, you know, you're talking about networks and linking up with different things. And I think one of the benefits, spin-offs of COVID has been we have all looked for other ways of linking up as church. So
Right.
my question is, do we have to rely, do we see sort of two churches therefore emerging? There is the official church, hierarchy-driven, clerical, and some people in our group spoke about young priests being even more wedded to, you know, to store the versions of the story that we can't buy into. So do we see that as one? And on the other hand, almost an alternative church, which is these networks and Zoom conversations and, you know, an international gathering like today, where I find myself much more challenged and nurtured than I will if I go to my Good Friday service next week.
Yeah, I think when evolution is an interesting phenomenon, and when evolutionary shifts begin to happen, I guess there is a time when you have two parallel lines. What's happening inevitably, one is going to keep breaking down more and more. And unfortunately, this is true politically as well as ecclesiastically. When breakdown begins to happen seriously, people can become extremely defensive. We saw that in the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump. That's what a lot of that was about. People in an absolute state of panic that America, the mighty nation, was no longer the mighty nation. And therefore, yeah, people went into this very negative, violent kind of resistance against change. So it'll be a messy stuff for a while. In a sense, the whole sex abuse thing in the church, I hope I can say this without being too hurtful or disturbing to anybody, but it's a symptom of the crucifixion of clericalism. That's what it is. That's a big part of it. And I'm not trying to excuse anybody for the wrong done or anything like that. But yeah, it's a symptom of the crucifixion of clericalism. And our beloved church hasn't even come to admit that yet. So yes, you are right, there will be. But I think what will happen then in time is the new developments will begin to take a line of their own, and in time are likely to become the more dominant image, if you like. And that'll be a refounding from the ground up with, I believe, lay people leading the way. And that relates to one question that came in also on the chat And is Christianity relevant to young people? We shouldn't be judging Christianity too much in terms of young people. Of course, we all like to have our young people on board, but I think wise elders are going to be critical to the future of all authentic religion. And keep in mind that as of 2020, we have more people now on the planet over the age of 60 than under 16 for the first time ever. I think the future success of our church, the future breakthrough, will happen through wise elders primarily, and not through young people. How we hold young people, how we support them, how we bring them on board, I know continues to be a serious pastoral issue. Yes, it does. But I think we need to be more discerning on how we create the pathways into this different future that many people are desiring. Now, I'm going to bring in Alison, and then I want to answer one or two comments on the chat box, and then I'll see how I'll be fixed for time. Alison, come in, please.
Hi. Yeah, it's leading on a little bit, and maybe you've answered part of it from the last lady, because you're talking about the church and not needing clericalism, so much more laity and the empowerment of men and women. But I was thinking as well, like the other lady, about the more the structure of the church, and that because I know you said about maybe not concentrating on women priests, but if priests and bishops are the decision makers at the moment and there's not as many women voices there, then how does the church take a different direction or evolve more with the opinions and views and voices of women as well, because it's set in such a patriarchal situation? Even though I get it totally, like the grassroots and the empowerment of the laity bringing about justice and peace, but I suppose it's that structure side, and that sort of links in with the morning group about the Stations of the Cross you were doing, about the whole global economics is based on a framework of like capitalism that exploits people and planet, and you can do grassroots, and we've seen so many things with Black Lives Matter and women's rights and things, but one stroke of a pen and our governments and the whole global system can make decisions that aren't good for the planet. But do people know an alternative like economics? But I suppose it just seems such a huge picture, and I know grassroots is the way to go, but I suppose it's those structures that are so powerful.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and indeed that's a very genuine issue. And I find it very interesting that Pope Francis last Easter Sunday, after he had given the Orbi Orbi address or blessing, he then went to a meeting with business people from Italy. This had been arranged several months back. And among the things he said to them, he pleaded with them to try and work more or try and impress more on the Italian government, the need to start working at a totally different alternative economic system, one that would give a basic working wage to every citizen, irrespective of whether they're working or not. Now, this sounds like a kind of an over-idealistic idea. Believe it or not, that idea has been around for over 100 years. The basic living wage. And it's also widely known that if governments adopted it, it would save them millions, literally millions of pounds or euros, whatever it is, because it would cut out an enormous amount of the bureaucracy that's now in place to service a culture of debt. So there is thinking out there. And therefore, maybe the major challenge that's around for many of us, momentous and massive though a lot of these ideas may seem, if more people can begin thinking creatively about them and give creative imagination to them, then that can be an empowering starting place that could make a difference. Part of the indoctrination that we're all suffering from within the church and outside it is that we tend to judge things by action. And okay, people can waffle a lot. At the end of the day, it's action that makes the difference. But the quality of consciousness we take into our action making requires an enormous amount of urgent attention, because in many cases, it's not a good, empowering kind of consciousness. There's an old philosophical dictum: action follows thought. I prefer to put it, action follows perception and understanding. It's when our perception and understanding is more forthright, more informed, more imaginative, more empowering, then we're likely to come out with a different quality of action, which is urgently needed. Again, I know that's a fairly general response to your question, but I hope it's adequate for now. I'm conscious of time, so let me just deal with two queries that are on here. Yeah, just 1 minute, because one of them is quite important. Can you say more about what you mean specifically by meaningless suffering? That's an extremely good question. This was addressed several years ago by a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, and here in my home country of Ireland by a well-known theologian, Gabriel Daly. Most of the meaningless suffering in the world, when we analyze it closely, is actually caused directly or indirectly by us human beings. And therefore, if we could become more aware of that and begin withdrawing our projections, we would have a very different world. So there is suffering in the world caused by natural disasters, for example, or caused by earthquakes. And earthquakes are absolutely essential to the viability of planet Earth. But that's the suffering that's innate to the evolutionary becoming of creation itself. A lot of for example, the Katrina event that happened in New Orleans a few years ago, I read two very interesting scientific commentaries on that. That events of this nature have been happening in the United States for many, many years, but that in recent years, they have become much more severe and destructive. Why? And both these scientists used almost exactly the same words in two totally different articles, because we humans are now interfering at a level that's modifying the outer realms of space-time and therefore exacerbating the ferocity of these events. So even in terms of natural disasters, probably a lot of the extra, what I call the meaningless suffering, is inculcated directly or indirectly by us humans. Therefore, for us humans need to start withdrawing these projections and these wrong interventions. Firstly, we need to be able to respect that paradox of creation and destruction that's there in creation itself, and then discern, I hope, more appropriate responses. So again, coming back to COVID-19, our interference in order to make money and selfish gain and our exploitation of the other creatures is a major contributory factor to the meaninglessness of what our planet is enduring at the present time. So that's what I had in mind when I made that comment. And then the other one I want to give a quick response to, just one moment till I locate it. Is the glorification of Mary and the demonization of Mary Magdalene significant? Now, the glorification of Mary is a subject that would require much more time, because across the Catholic world particularly, people have a huge devotion to Mary, and it's often empowering for them. But it's comforting and consoling, and sometimes can be empowering. It can also lead into devotions that can at times trap people in poverty rather than help them out of it. The demonization of Mary Magdalene is partly due to certain passages in the scriptures of she being possessed by 7 demons and so forth, which was really propagated by a pope, one of the Pope St. Gregory's around the 500s or 600s. And scripture scholars of all backgrounds have acknowledged the fact that there's no basis whatsoever to that. So if that's what the questioner has in mind, I hope that's a partial response and an adequate one for now. Friends, I'm suggesting we were scheduled for a 15-minute break. Could we make it 10 minutes, please? And we'll come back at 25 to 3. And then we'll move into the final parts, which will include a bit of further space for people that may want to make some comments or contributions. So 10-minute break. See you back at 25 to 3.